The tents appeared in the middle of the night, without preamble. There was some heated discussion at City Hall, because not even the mayor knew they were coming. They must have worked out something, though, because the gypsy circus stayed. Our town wasn't big enough to support even a fair, so this was big news. That was how I found myself with my older brother Tommy and his friends that evening. I was just 15 then, and though we were in a small town now, my mother hailed from Boston. There was no way she would cut me loose to run around on my own, but if she'd known how bad Tommy and his friends really were, she would have known I was much better off alone. "How much money you got?" Frankie asked, punching my shoulder. Of the 3 older boys, I hated him the most. He regularly hit, kicked, and ridiculed me, while my own brother laughed about it. He was twice my size. I was a runt back then, but I dreamed of the day I could stand up to him. Stand up to them all. I gave him the 20 Mom had given me, but not the 5 I had tucked in my hat bill. If nothing else, I wanted to sneak a candy apple later. Dad was a dentist, and we didn't have things like that around my house. They abandoned me when we walked inside that midway. I'd never been to a circus before. There weren't many rides, but huge tents loomed everywhere. Barkers told us to come one, come all, see the magnificent beasts of the wild or the horrifying freaks of nature. I laughed at that one. I'd ridden in with the freaks of nature. Still, I wanted to see a lion. They looked so majestic on television. Reluctantly, I parted with $2 and stepped inside. The tent smelled of sawdust, sweat, and dung, but inside were the most fantastic creatures I'd ever seen. I picked a peanut off the ground and fed it to an elephant, then sat on a bench to await the show. The lions were my favorite part. I knew they were big, but I never expected anything that huge. I held my breath when the lion tamer stuck his head in one creature's mouth. Its incisors looked as long as my fingers. Its back teeth, which I knew were called carnicles from a book my dad gave me, worked like scissors to cut and tear meat. No way would I ever have had the guts to stick my head in there. After the show, I debated spending another $2 to watch the same show again, but I really wanted that apple. As I made my way to the food trailers, a girl called out to me, "Read your fortune for $1." The sight of her took my breath. For the rest of my life, I dream about her face. I wish that she could have seen her own fortune instead of mine that night. She didn't deserve what happened to her. I stared at her, transfixed. Her eyes were 2 different colors. I wondered if she wore contact lens to achieve the effect in order to look more striking. One was icy blue and the other brown, like mine. The effect was jarring, even more so because she was lovely. Long black hair, full lips, dressed like a genie from a TV show with her smooth, tan belly bared. Hormones trumped hunger, and I let her lead me into her tent. She took my palm and stretched it out in front of her. She talked for a while, giving me vague predictions. Then she gave me a long look and said, "You need to stand up for yourself. Do not let others control your fate." I always wondered about that later, if she really saw that. It proved to be good advice. I wish I'd heeded it. She walked me out after my reading, her hand tucked into my arm. "Well, what do we have here?" Frankie boomed. "The little monkey has a girlfriend." Her hand tightened on my arm, and then she smiled. "I'm taking a break." Frankie caught her arm as she tried to walk by, and Tommy and his friend James blocked her. I wanted to tell them to leave her alone, but my voice was a frog hung in my throat. "Hang on," Frankie said. "I got $1. I want my fortune told. Matter of fact." He leered at her. "What will a 10 get me?" To my horror, he grabbed her waist and pulled her against him. She struggled free and snarled something in a foreign language. Then she spat on his shoe. Frankie backhanded her, then dragged her into the tent. I turned to run, and James tripped me. I went sprawling into the dust, and my mouth filled with blood. James hauled me up, and I heard a click as he opened the switchblade he always carried. He pressed it against my back. "One move and I'll slice your spinal cord," he said. "Snitches end up in ditches." It only lasted a few minutes, but it seemed like an eternity. They brutalized that girl. I heard her struggle at first, Then nothing. That nothing terrified me. I was crying, blood and snot choking me. People walked right on by and nobody seemed to notice something was wrong. Something was horrible. The newspaper said her father found her, naked and beaten in that tent. It was 2 days before she could give the police a description. I was relieved when the police pulled up in front of our house. "Don't you say a word," Tommy hissed, "or I swear on my life I'll end you." I wish I could say that I spoke up, told the police everything, but I didn't. I thought her description would be enough, and the DNA, but I misjudged small-town politics. Frankie, Tommy, and James spun some story about the girl being a prostitute and soliciting them for money. They said she grew angry when they didn't have enough and threatened to cry rape if they didn't bring her money. They said another gypsy had beat her to make the story look real. The judge closed his briefcase and let them go. We walked outside together. I have never felt so sick, ashamed. Tommy and his friends stood beside me in their fresh suits and ties, looking like altar boys. An old gypsy woman approached. She muttered something, then made a sign in the air with her gnarled finger. Frankie stepped toward her, and James caught his arm. The girl sobbed against her father, her beautiful face still swollen and discolored. She whispered something to the old woman and pointed at me. The old woman's eyes narrowed and she made another sign. "That's enough," my father said, and led us away. The circus disappeared, and within a week my brother and his friends were dead. Tommy got his hand caught in the garbage disposal at the restaurant he worked after school. As it chewed his arm, they thought the pain was making him delusional because he was screaming about the lion's teeth. He bled out before the ambulance got there. James fell off a ladder while he was helping his father patch their roof. The fall severed his spinal cord. Advertisements Frankie died the most horribly of all. He wrecked around Johnson's Bend one night, and his car caught on fire. Rescuers said they'd never forget his screams. I figured he's still screaming and burning in the place he went. I dreamed about the old woman every night. She said, "Your crime is silence. You stood quietly and let evil reign. Thus, sealed your fate." One morning, my tongue felt funny. When I peered in the mirror, it looked like a piece of bark was attached to it. It felt like bark too. Mom was still in her room, so I didn't bother her. I somehow knew it was my time. I went to the woods behind our house. My steps grew heavier as I walked, and I could barely drag my feet through the leaves. When I looked down, my legs no longer looked human. They were forming into a tree trunk. Roots curled from my toes and spiked into the ground. I raised my hand to feel my tongue and my arm froze there. Bark raced down it, falling in place like Legos connecting, covering what was human. With no surprise, I saw the girl walk out of the woods. "I know it wasn't your fault," she said. "I begged my Baba for mercy. She said you must learn a lesson. You will be a tree until you grow and mature enough to bear fruit. When the first apple falls from your tree, you will be human again. I hope you will always stand up for yourself and others after that." Dark, cold, and eerie. Those are the only words I can come up with to describe the house in which I had lived with my family for the majority of my life. Mostly dark, blistering cold during the winter, and always eerie. Sometimes there would be strange noises coming from the cellar, too. It had often given me the creeps, though I would never admit that to my mother. I'd figured I was too old to let some silly noises scare me anyway. I had been trying to act like the man of the house ever since my dad left when I was 7. I had always hoped I would never turn out like my father, whom I hated with a burning passion. As far as he goes, I suppose I'd better just leave it at that. I lived in the house with my mother, Linda, and my uncle Kevin on a vast piece of land in Steinen, Indiana. Steinen was a tiny piece of shit in the middle of nowhere. Nobody liked living there. I didn't have any friends because I was homeschooled, and I'd never even seen another kid my age in Steinen, since we almost never left the house unless my mom had to go into town to buy groceries. However, I was always very close to Uncle Kevin. When I was little, he would tell me ghost stories right before bed, which my mother hated. "Stop it, Kev! You're going to give him nightmares!" she would snap. Oh, I did get nightmares indeed, and sometimes it seemed as though the nightmares refused to end. They crept into the back of my mind like a spider crafting its web. The story he told most often was one about a monster with a contorted body and black eyes. According to the legend, as Uncle Kevin called it, even though I knew he made it up himself, the monster would come into your room if you were awake past your bedtime and hide in your closet, watching you the whole night. Of course, this was just a silly little tale that Kevin would tell me so I wouldn't stay up late. Even so, I can't tell you how many times that horrible creature has popped into my head over the years. On this particular night, I decided to go to bed early in an attempt to sleep off a pounding headache. I lied down on my icy bed and sank underneath the covers, hiding my face from whatever may have been lurking inside of my head. After setting my glasses down on the nightstand beside my bed, I reached over and flicked the light off. The darkness made me feel alive in a very strange way, almost as though I was mesmerized by the nothingness. As I looked around the room, seeing almost nothing but the pitch-black darkness surrounding me, I felt entranced, as if something was forcing me to look. Of course, there was nothing to look at least not with the eyes. This was something you could only witness within the deepest corridors of your mind, the part of your mind that you always dread visiting and can never seem to return from. Out of nowhere, I began to hear scratches upon the window above my bed. My eyes immediately burst open, and I felt like I was unable to close them again. What the fuck was that? I asked myself. Nothing. Of course, it was nothing. It couldn't have been anything, right? Right. Just my mind playing tricks on me in the dark. No big deal. But in a moment of childish curiosity, I decided to peer out the window, just to make sure I was hearing nothing more than a tree branch brushing up against the glass. But then it hit me like a bag of bricks. There is no tree next to my window. Still, I decided it would be better to sleep it off and think more about it in the morning. It was probably all in my head. It had to be. I found it unusually difficult to fall asleep that night, as if somebody or something was trying to keep me up. I woke up the next morning with that sound still locked in my brain. It had to have been coming from somewhere. But where? Shit, I had no idea. But then I remembered. The cellar. I built up as much courage as I could muster and slowly crept down into the abyss. Jesus, I hadn't been down there in a year, maybe longer. I'd almost forgotten what it looked like. Nothing but clouds of cobwebs and stacks of cardboard boxes shoved against the walls. I rustled through a couple of boxes until I stumbled upon a picture I'd drawn when I was a child. It was a sketch of a grotesque creature. It definitely wasn't human. This thing barely even had a face, just dark black eyes and no mouth. Its body was tall and thin, and was contorted into a shape that I had never even seen before. The more I looked at the drawing, the more I was reminded of that story my uncle used to tell me. It appeared to be raining above the creature, and toward the bottom of the paper, I had scribbled, "Please stay awake," in giant letters. I didn't know what the hell that was supposed to mean, but I folded up the paper and stuffed it in my pocket. I quickly made my way up the staircase into the kitchen and went about my day as usual, keeping that drawing in my mind, trying to remember what it meant and why I'd drawn it in the first place. I looked outside and noticed that it had begun to rain. I didn't want to think about that creature any longer, so I walked into my dimly lit room and plopped onto my bed. I fell asleep before I even knew it. When I awoke, it was exactly 3 a.m. This night was colder and darker than usual. The farm was soaked with rain from earlier in the evening. The moon was full and radiant. It almost didn't look real. For an instant, I glanced out of my bedroom window, and I could swear I saw something walking quickly through the yard. When it spotted me, it slunk behind a tree, as if it were trying to hide from me. It looked exactly like what I had drawn when I was a child. I ran into Uncle Kevin's room and began shaking him awake. "Kevin! Kevin!" He rubbed the room out of his eyes. "What's up, bud?" "It's late," he asked, bewildered at my excitement. I looked him in his bloodshot eyes and softly said, "I saw someone in the yard." Kevin looked at me with hesitation. "No, you probably just saw an animal. Get back to bed." I know what I saw. This was no animal, or at least not one that I had ever seen, not even in my worst fucking nightmares. I knew I couldn't tell him exactly what I had seen, as he would never believe me. "No, Kevin, it was not an animal. Please. It was a man. I think... Look, just please go out and check." Uncle Kevin leapt up and grabbed his shotgun from under the bed. "All right, come on. Show me where he is. Let's try not to wake your mom. I'll scare the fucker off." We went outside and I pointed to the tree. I whispered to Kevin, "I saw him go behind that tree." My uncle bravely walked up to the tree and peered around it. Nothing. He searched the entire farm for well over half an hour, but he never found anyone or anything. "Let's go back in, bud. There's no one out here. Keep the doors locked tonight." He was wrong. I knew there was something out there. I crawled into bed and threw the covers over my face. I could hear the blistering wind coming from outside. It pierced my ears with a whistle that I thought only dogs could detect. Suddenly, I heard a tapping sound upon my window. The sound grew louder with each tap. I tightened the blankets around my body. The taps slowly turned into knocks. Louder and faster the knocks became. The knocks turned into bangs. I thought the glass was going to break. Then, out of nowhere, it stopped. No more taps, no more knocks, no more bangs, no more wind. I was relieved. Suddenly, I heard a low, chilling voice in my ear. "Please, stay awake." It couldn't be. No, it couldn't be. I ran into the hallway, ready to make my way to my mother's room when I saw it. Whatever it was, I still don't know. It was holding Kevin's lifeless, mangled body in its arms. Carved deeply into my uncle's torso were the words, "Please stay awake." I tried to let out a scream, but only silence filled the dead air. I sprinted through the door of my mother's bedroom and saw her body lying in the middle of the floor. She was covered in blood, and her left arm had been ripped straight out of its socket. Written next to her in her own blood were the words, "Please stay awake." I began to sob, and when I turned around, the creature was gone. I don't know where the hell it went, and I'm not sure I want to. I closed my eyes as tightly as I could and let out the loudest scream I could muster. I called the police and lied down on the cold, now blood-soaked floor, waiting for them to arrive. It felt like hours. Finally, the police showed up to find me in the fetal position next to my mother's corpse. I told them everything I saw. I showed them my drawing. I told them about the taps, the knocks, the bangs. I told them what I'd seen outside. But of course, they wouldn't hear a word of it. Why would they? All they could see was a lonely kid hovering over his dead mother, her blood covering my clothes almost as much as it covered the floor. It's cold in this cell. It's dark and lonely. The silence is the only saving grace. Constant, peaceful silence. Tonight, it's raining outside. It's colder, darker, and wetter than ever. But unfortunately, I must stop writing now. I just heard a tap on my window. I've had this problem for as long as I can remember. In preschool, I remember being confused when they told us there were 7 days in a week because I could only ever count 6. I've never told anyone this, not even my wife, so I've never really been able to ask, but I can gather from careful questions that the ME they see on Thursdays acts the exact same way and says the same general things I would. If plans are made for Thursdays, I show up and do exactly what I would do. I just don't ever remember it. Before you ask, yes, I've tried staying up all Wednesday night or waking up in the middle of the night. It never works. I wake up in my bed on Friday. I feel sorry for the Thursday me. He's never going to have a weekend. I worked it out, and he only has Christmas once every 7 years or so. It's not fair that I get to have so much more life than him. One thing I do know is he doesn't like to keep a diary. If anyone ever goes through my journal, I wonder if they'll notice I've never made an entry for Thursday in all these years. I wish the Thursday me would write sometimes. If he did, I'd be able to figure out once and for all whether he's really a separate person or if he's just an unconscious me or anything. Last week, I decided I would give him a break. I took Thursday off. I went to bed on Wednesday, and I hoped Thursday me would make the most of it. Friday, I woke up and got ready for work. There was a very strange smell in the kitchen. It was an oily, burnt smell. It made me feel like something was sticking to my skin. I sprayed some air freshener and took out the garbage without investigating it. Before I left, my wife came out of the bedroom in her pajamas and hugged me deeply. "Hey, what's this about?" I said. "You don't normally wake up this early to say goodbye to me." "I just wanted to thank you for the wonderful dinner you made last night," she said. "What did you say that dish was called? It was incredible." "Advertisements. I don't remember, honestly. I just flipped open my mom's cookbook to a random page. I'll have to look it up again this afternoon." She kissed me. Her breath smelled like the kitchen. "Well, whatever it was, figure it out and make it again soon. I love you so much." "Love you too," I said. At work, everyone was happy to see me. Richie, the guy who works next door to my cubicle, slapped me on the back. "That was an amazing party last night, buddy." My supervisor, Helen, dropped by my desk. "If you're going to throw a get-together like that every time, then you can take off as many days as you'd like. I can't believe how much I ate." There was a big greasy stain on her blouse. It looked like she'd been wearing a messy bib. As the day went on, more and more people thanked me and shook my hand and asked me where I'd learned to cook like that. There were people I never even talked to, like the janitors and the security guys. Toward the end of the day, a woman I had never seen before spoke to me. I could see from her ID badge that she was a secretary from our other facility across town. She said, "I've always thought I was an adventurous eater, but after last night, wow, I'd never eaten anything like that before." "What did you say that dish was called?" She had a black glob stuck between her teeth. I said, "I can't believe I don't remember. It was in my cookbook. I'll have to look it up and get back to you." "Please do." By the end of the day, I hadn't gotten a bit of work done. So many people, strangers, had talked to me I was completely overwhelmed. As I drove home, I almost expected a cop to pull me over and asked me what I had cooked last night. I had to figure out what it was. When I got home, I went into the alley behind my house and opened up the garbage can. The smell was so powerful I started gagging. It was like nothing I'd ever smelled before, greasy, burnt, and metallic. It made me sick, but at the same time it was appealing, almost addicting. As I sorted through the trash, it seemed like I was breathing deeper, trying to get more. All the scraps were covered in black globs like the secretary had had between her teeth. The globs stuck to me as I wiped them off the long curved bones and fleshy sacks I pulled out of the garbage bag. One of the things I pulled out looked like a tiny human hand, an inch across with two thumbs on one side. It was held together with fibrous connective tissue. I touched one frayed tendon dangling from its wrist, and it clenched into a tight fist I couldn't open again. I picked something up, which was unmistakably a skull, 2 inches across, with shards of gray, fatty meat still clinging to its face. But its single eye socket was completely clean, like someone had sucked it dry with a long tongue. Its jaw was too narrow and locked open like it was screaming. I found a tentacle filled with bubbles of black liquid that, if I touched them, would burst and evaporate instantly. I found a strip of skin, bright red with grill marks on one side and covered in gray hairs that were stretchy like rubber and needle-sharp at the tip. I couldn't take it anymore. I vomited. I left the pile of refuse and the overturned garbage can in the alley and ran upstairs through the back door. I washed my hands in the bathroom because the smell was still in the kitchen. I came into the living room and my wife smiled at me. I could smell it on her. "I'm starving, honey," she said. I haven't eaten all day. I'm waiting to see what you make for us tonight." I could only laugh unconvincingly in response. I went into the bedroom. My journal was open on the nightstand, open to Thursday's entry. "Thank you so much for this opportunity, old friend. I'll take more days next week." I usually like to watch TV with my little sister, Kimberly. She was only 5, so of course she watched all the cutesy kids shows. I didn't really mind, though. They made her happy, and I liked spending time with her. She watched shows like Dora, Blue's Clues, and Arthur. We often had a lot of DVDs of old kids' shows around the house that we would watch. There was a large box of old movies and TV shows in the attic. I took a brief look at it once, but none of them looked like they would appeal to her. One day, Kimberly was at a doctor's appointment, and I thought I'd have time to watch a movie aimed more towards my age range, so I thought this would be a good time to look through the box of old movies in the attic. While I looked through the box, I noticed that these movies didn't really interest me, but I kept looking in hopes to find something. Then I saw, at the bottom of the box, a DVD labeled Colwyn's Corner. Many memories started to come back to me. I used to watch this show as a kid. It was about an orange puppet named Colwyn who lived in a house on the corner of a street. He would often have his other puppet friends come over to play games and sing songs. It was cute and innocent, and I remember really liking it as a kid. I thought this would be a good show for my sister and I to watch. When Kimberly got home, I told her I got a new show for us to watch. She got excited and sat down on the couch while I put the disc in. I sat down next to her as the selection screen popped up. The screen looked just as I remembered it. It showed Colwyn and his friends in front of the house. I chose the first episode and the theme song began. I was a little confused. The colors were a lot darker than I remember, and the song was sung a lot slower and in a deeper voice. I didn't think much of it as I hadn't seen the show in a long time, and I probably forgot some elements of it. Advertisements. The show began pretty normally. Colwyn was in his house and said hello to the viewers. There was a knock on his door and he said, "I think my friends are here." When he opened the door, I felt my heart to my throat. Standing at the door were 2 tall white puppets with no nose or mouth, only pitch black eyes. I was shocked because I don't even remember these characters on the show. Even the cover of the DVD showed 2 colorful, friendly puppets. I looked over at Kimberly, and she had this big smile on her face. I was confused, since an image like that would terrify a child. "I'm not sure if we should watch this anymore," I told her. "No, please, keep it on," she exclaimed. I continued watching as the giant puppets didn't seem to faze her. The 2 large puppets came into the house. Colwyn asked, "What do you guys want to do today?" The one puppet replied with the most horrific sound I ever heard. It sounded like a man was shouting, almost screaming in a strange language. The audio was very distorted. At this point, I got up and ejected the disc from the VCR, much to Kimberly's disappointment. "Why did you stop it? Put it back on," she said. I didn't listen and put the DVD in a drawer. Even though Kimberly wasn't bothered by the show, I still thought it was too disturbing for a 5-year-old. I had trouble sleeping that night. I kept thinking about the video. I watched that show all the time when I was younger. I definitely have seen every episode. I didn't understand why I didn't remember an episode like this. I was still curious about the rest of the episode. I decided to go downstairs to finish it. I took the DVD out of the drawer and put it in the VCR. I put on headphones so the noise wouldn't disturb my family. The episode began the same, with the strange intro and the large puppets. After the one puppet made the terrifying sound, Colwyn replied, "You're right, we should play a game." He then grabbed a knife off the counter. It cut to a live-action arm painted orange to represent Colwyn's. The knife went up to the arm and started to cut slits, each one deeper than the last. Colwyn started to scream a blood-curdling scream. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I felt sick to my stomach. Blood gushed out of the wounds as the screams got louder and louder. It then cut to a live-action neck painted orange. The knife went up to the throat and cut a deep slit in it, and blood began gushing out. It showed Colwyn gasping heavily for air before his eyes turned completely white. The episode ended with him falling to the ground as the two tall white puppets looked directly into the camera with pitch-black eyes. I was utterly terrified at this point. I immediately ejected the DVD and threw it in the trash. I couldn't sleep at all that night. I kept thinking about the episode. I got up the next morning and went downstairs to get some breakfast. I walked past Kimberly's room and saw that she wasn't in there. When I got downstairs, I saw her on the couch, finishing up the horrific episode I watched last night. I immediately grabbed the remote and turned the TV off. "Why did you do that?" she asked. "Where did you get the DVD?" I shouted. "It was in the garbage," she replied. "I took it out because I wanted to finish the episode." "This show is very bad," I shouted. "No, it's not," she said. "They were just baking a cake." "What?" I said. "The episode was about Colwyn and his friends baking a cake," she replied. I was shocked. "What did his friends look like?" I asked. "One was blue and one was red," she replied. "I really liked it. Can I watch it again?" I'm 16 years old, but I've moved 3 times already, but I still remember this to this day when I was 5 years old. When my mom put me to bed and turned off the light, I saw a tall figure with a top hat, and the worst part was the red eyes. The fucking red eyes. Every time I saw the eyes and the man, I would let out an ear-piercing scream, and my mom would come in scared, seeing me crying and pointing at the corner. She would roll her eyes, put me in her bed, and we would have a blast watching scary movies and action movies, willy-nilly from Transformers to Nightmare on Elm Street. I didn't mind the scary movies. It's just that every time I saw that man, I would let out a scream until it got to the point where my mom just let me sleep in her room. Fast forward, my mom got kicked out of the house for smoking weed, but she gave me a Nintendo Wii before she got kicked out. I still loved my mom, but it was weird because when she was gone, the man stopped appearing. But here's the worst part. I saw him in dreams every Tuesday and screamed. When my grandma got tired of the screaming, I slept with my grandpa. Fast forward, I was 12 or maybe 13, and my uncle and aunt just moved in with my cousin and new cousin. I never got to sleep in my room because it was being used for my newborn cousin, or, well, he was 2 years old. The only time I was allowed in there was when I went to get toys. But when I slept either downstairs in the basement or upstairs on the floor with my grandpa, I would always get a girl with huge fangs and black eyes. It happened every 1 to 2 weeks, and I would wake up scared shitless, then stay up all night watching TV or playing video games on my grandpa's phone, Xbox 360 or PlayStation 4. This kept going until I was 14 and finally moved into my own room. Not even a day later, I got a new ghost, but it was a little boy. He said that his mommy and daddy were sorry about what they had done to me. I was so confused until I realized, and when I woke up the next morning, I looked up my address. Apparently, there was a married couple with a boy who brutally died. Not long after, I moved out because my uncle was given the house and decided to sell it. When I moved into the new house, I got a weird feeling about it. Not to mention the house was old, with a rusty shed out back and old rooms. I didn't care, but I was in this stage where I said, "Fuck everyone," and stayed up much longer than everyone else, going to bed at 3 or 2 a.m. During these days, I played COD and GTA, the usual games, and I would hear noises coming from above. Not to mention when the lights were off, I would hear whispers of how I wanted to hang myself or stab myself. I didn't mention it because I knew I was never suicidal. I had a lot of people who cared about me. As a year went by, things got worse. I kept having nightmares about murder, death, and people screaming about how suicide was the only way out. I said, "Fine, fuck it." And then I pulled the same thing at the old house and looked up the history of the house. Apparently, it was the house of a big family that was being hunted and committed suicide by hanging themselves. I was horrified and asked about this to the owner since we were renting. She went pale and ignored me, and I was shocked but didn't care. Now, this year's date, We got kicked out because the owner got tired of the house payments going up, so she decided to sell it. We moved into my uncle's, but as much as I was there, things started to go missing, and things started to move on their own. I asked my aunt about it, and they knew about it and named the ghost. Instead of being creeped out, I got curious, not because of the history of the house, but because of the ghost. At this point, I wanted to be friendly to the dead. When I have dreams of ghosts that usually scare people, instead I talk to them. Some don't respond, some do, and some use sign language. I think I've grown a connection to the dead, but I don't mind it at this point. Christ, I muttered to myself as the first flakes of snow started to fall. They gathered in fuzzy clumps over the windshield before my wipers cleared them away. I'd been waiting for 20 minutes now, in my sister's driveway. Had I chosen to wait inside with her, I'd have been dead by now thanks to her 2 gray cats. Cute little devils, but murder to my sinuses. Puffy eyes and a clogged up throat. That's just what I needed. Every Christmas, our family made the annual trip to my grandparents' cabin tucked away in the woods of Hope, Alaska, and I'd hoped to beat the heavy snowfall that was forecasted. Since my sister's license was suspended from a DUI, here I was, a hostage to time, with my finger tapping anxiously on the steering wheel. When my mother had asked me to be the one to grab my sister, I had honestly dreaded it from the start. It wasn't that we hated one another, we just weren't as close anymore. After decades of constant arguments and bitter disagreements, we became distant and our relationship fizzled. Yes, we were siblings, but it felt more accurate to call us the residue of what siblings once were. Finally, like the gates of Valhalla, her front door opened and out she came. Her hair was forest green. The last time I'd seen her, it had been white. The time before that, it was violet. "Got everything?" I asked as she clambered her way into the passenger seat. She responded as she adjusted her glasses and stuffed a few bags in the back seat. And just like that, we were off. Hope was about a 30-minute drive, and it didn't take long for the awkward silence to inflate between us. It didn't help that the radio didn't work in my car and that the broken auxiliary port made your music sound like it was having a seizure. By the time we reached the turnoff for Hope Highway, the road was turning into a thick white sheet. Thankfully, on Christmas Eve night, the long stretch to Hope's small community was quick and vacant. The cabin was tucked away in a fortress of trees 5 miles off the main road. As I made the turn, my sister cracked the window, pulled out a blunt, and lit it with her lighter. "Want a hit?" she asked. Snow crunched beneath us. "Not while I'm driving." "It's a straight path. We're practically there already." She took a drag and blew it out the window. "I want to just focus on this, all right?" She huffed and pushed up her glasses. "If you're that worried, maybe slow down a bit then." There was the jab, a piece of bait to lure me into another fight. But I wasn't going to bite, not this time. She could live with us getting there faster. The drive was almost over, and soon I'd be in a warm living room with my feet up, a spiked eggnog in my hand, and Bobby Helms's Jingle Bell Rock in the air. I could already hear Uncle Jed spouting off one of his crude jokes. "Why does Santa Claus have such a big—" "Dude!" my sister shrieked, jabbing a finger in my side and whipping my mind back to the windshield. The car had just finished winding around the thick trail. The large body of a reindeer stood in our path. Eyes wide open and blank, it didn't move as the high beams found it. Snapped into a panic, I twisted the wheels in a desperate swerve. The car veered greasily to the side in a fine spray of slosh. The reindeer, also known as a caribou, remained still, even as the bumper soared inches from its nose. We came to a crunching halt off the main path. "Jesus," I sighed, blessed with relief. "Did we hit it?" "No," my sister said, leaning out the window to check while exhaling another plume of smoke. I wound the steering wheel back around and pressed on the gas. The wheels shrilled in place, kicking up globs of sleet, but not moving an inch. "Perfect," I moaned, and unfolded myself from the seat to check it out. The two front tires were caked in black slush and practically swallowed in a mound of snow. I kicked at it, trying to clear off the icy debris from the treads and beneath the wheel well. When that tired me out, I resorted to scraping it off with my fingers. "Screw off, Prancer!" I heard my sister call toward the dark silhouette of the reindeer, its antlers like gnarled fingers reaching for the treetops. Then she made a sort of startled yip, followed by a, "What the fuck?" I looked up from the scrim of snow. The reindeer was now standing tall on both of its hind legs. It looked strange, like a silly caricature you'd see in a kid's book. But out there, in the silence of the woods, it was a creepy image. The way its vague shape stood on just two legs held an almost human-like balance. For whatever reason, I realized then it didn't have a tail. Its muscular neck craned to the side and let out an ululating scream, a miserable squeal of metal grinding against metal. My legs were ice sculptures, cementing me to the spot as the shriek quieted to a succession of wet grunts. The reindeer dropped down to its original posture and stomped heavily. Puffs of white vapor and strings of snot vented from its nostrils. I was no hunter, but it didn't take a lot to tell when a pissed-off animal was about to charge. I leapt for the driver's seat, pulled the door open, and slammed it shut just as the muffled thud of hooves reached me. Antlers scraped the door as its large body practically flew over the patch I had just been standing in. Fast, very fast. My sister screamed as the large bulk of its frame wound back around and charged again, this time shattering the headlights and submerging us in darkness. "Just go already!" my sister hollered in my ear. "I'm trying, goddammit!" I hissed. The wheels continued to spin helplessly. We were trapped. Advertisements. The creature charged again, this time nailing the window. A cobweb of cracks bloomed near my sister's head. I searched for anything, literally anything, that I could use as a weapon. I was never really a gun enthusiast, but at that moment I'd have shaved my head and joined the secular monks if it meant having a Glock in my hand right then and there. After rattling the car once more, the reindeer finally appeared to lose interest and disappeared amidst the cluster of trees. Granted some time to breathe and think, we phoned our dad and told him about the situation. He was going to come down in his pickup and get us unstuck and out of this mess. I looked over at my sister, who was taking long and steady breaths between her fingers. "Are you all right?" I asked. "What do you think?" she grumbled. "I told you to slow down." Another jab, and this time I wasn't going to have it. "You want to be useful?" I yelled. "Get out there and push. No? Then shut the hell up. I don't need it right now." She said nothing else, and neither did I, returning once again to the pocket of silence that our relationship succumbed to. The sooner Dad's headlights peeked in the distance, the better. Suddenly, she rolled the window down. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Shh." She pursed her lips. "Just listen." Humoring her, I waited, and sure enough, the sound reached me too. The quiet voice of a little girl coming from outside. "Somebody," it whimpered. "I'm lost. Please help me. I'm lost." My sister unlocked the door and motioned to open it. I grabbed her wrist. "Advertisements." "What are you doing?" she snapped. "There's someone out there." "Just wait a second. It's weird, isn't it?" The voice continued to whine, choking between sobs and pleading for someone, anyone, to help her. I didn't like the way it sounded. The same lasting drawl between words, the same weeping sounds, like someone was hitting repeat on a speaker. Something wasn't right, and my instincts were hoisting red flags left and right. Then my sister looked at me, and her expression warped into shock. She flung back, pinning both shoulders against the interior. Things that sounded like words bubbled up, but didn't quite make it out of her throat. I turned and saw what was looking at me. It had the face of a man, surrounded by the mottled fur of a caribou's body. The skin was a mummified brown color, wound tightly around its long skull like old, crinkled leather. Snowflakes landed upon its wide, expressionless eyes and melted into the dark membranes of its pupils. It circled the car, bobbing its antlers and fogging up the windows as it peered inside. My heart shook the walls of my throat. I locked eyes with my sister, unable to say anything behind the sheer disbelief. I should have grabbed my phone, snapped a photo, recorded a video. Anything. But my thoughts were jangled. It then let out that same horrible scream, but I didn't see its tight, contorted lips open. The sound was coming from its neck. Small, fleshy orifices, flapping open like mouths, were converting the high-pitched shrill into the mimicked cry of a little girl. "Help me! I'm lost! Help me!" Headlights glazed the area. My father's pickup came into view, paving its way down the path. The reindeer, or whatever the fuck it was, ran off, vanishing once again into the snow-covered thicket. Nobody believed us. Why would they? If anybody had told me that story, I would have assumed they were hopped up on some crazy psychedelic. But the reality of what I saw was cold, and it's something I still to this day can't fully swallow. Instead of sleeping that night, my sister and I did some research that led us to the myth of skinwalkers, beings of some sort, capable of mimicking voices and disguising themselves as animals to lure people into the woods. After reading other accounts, there wasn't a doubt in my mind what we'd witnessed out there. Every so often that night, I'd stare out the window and eye the yard, wondering if I'd see that leathery face watching from the tree line. Neither I nor my sister ever made that trip again, much to the frustration of my family. But there was a silver lining. She and I have never been closer. I've worked at a movie theater for 2 years now. I'm 19, just graduated high school. But anyways, I've been wanting to ask someone about this, but I feel like someone would tell me I'm going insane, and I'm just paranoid because they haven't experienced the one coworker who has experienced the same thing left, and our 2 security guards who change every day. Anyways, when I turned 18, I started getting super closing shifts and whatnot, which basically is like someone who closes out a grocery store or last one out of the building. It's an average job that anyone could do, but anyways, a coworker who I worked with told me a story about when she super closed once. She told me she cleared the women's restroom out and nobody but Mark, the other super closer, was on the floor and in the building. She had to stop and use the restroom she made, sure no one was in there, but after doing this she got done with her business and noticed the stall door next to her had a pair of feet. Not shoes, but bare feet, which is a little weird because nobody in their right mind goes into a public restroom with no shoes. She didn't say anything but kept her business to herself, and then when she was about to leave the stall, she now smells a horrible smell like death or something which absolutely doesn't smell like shit or anything. She basically got out of that stall, and then when she walked past the stall that had a pair of feet in them, she sees through the crack of the door that a woman is staring back at her. Now she becomes paranoid and tells her that the building is closed and she must leave. The woman says nothing but is still staring at her like she was watching her. Next, the coworker is about to leave the restroom right before she hears the stall door open, and the woman who was in that stall runs out and dead sprints right at her, so the coworker GTFOs outside the restroom, and when she gets out of that restroom, she inevitably looks back, and the woman didn't follow her out of the restroom. And apparently she never saw her again before she was fired because she was late to work one too many times. Okay, I'm a bit shaken up by her telling me this story, but she definitely was one of the weed smokers, but weed doesn't make you hallucinate like that. And she never would do mushrooms on a shift because she was still clocked in. So anyways, my mind starts to race, but other than that I closed it out and it was an uneventful night. But my next shift I was on utility, and while taking trash out of the theater, I noticed out of the corner of my eye a black shadowy mass that was watching me, and I stare at it point blank, and it was gone. I shook it off as my eyes playing tricks on me. Maybe it was just the lights playing tricks on me, but I couldn't explain the figure being at least 2 times my height, and I'm an average guy, I'm 5'9", and whatever I saw in that theater was definitely 2 times my height, and even as I remembered it more, it had a face too with no eyes. I definitely was now concerned about working there. A few months later, me and my manager for that shift were cleaning out a row in a theater. It was super busy that day and nobody could prank us because the other ushers were already about to clean a XD theater. Me and her are finishing up the same row, and next thing's next I hear this roar that no man could replicate it. It almost sounded animalistic, but I heard, and me and my manager lock eyes. I give it a few seconds because maybe it was a guest playing tricks with us and they were gonna run away, but I never heard footsteps, and this time I turn to my manager Kendra and I ask, "Did you hear that too?" She, being a 5'3", 20-year-old woman, turns to me and quivers out a, "Yeah." I tell her to call over the radio where the ushers are, and the other manager says they are cleaning 11. And then we now just book it out of 19. Year passes, and nothing like that until I hear a story from one of my fellow weed smokers who told me a few days ago about why I should never be in theater 11 alone like ever. She was cleaning 11, and as she's about to exit the theater, she hears a pair of footsteps running up and down the stairs, and then next thing, she investigates to see if anyone had came into the theater, and now she's all alone. She then goes to the top row and no one was hiding, and so she shakes it off as her brain playing tricks on her, and not even 5 minutes pass, and one of the maintenance workers runs into the theater she was cleaning in. He asks, "Did you see the emergency exit door propped open in 11? She now knows that this was now supernatural. On New Year's Day 2023, a family of 4 were going to watch a movie when they had an argument on which movie to watch, and the father runs to his car, grabs a revolver, and shoots himself right in front of his family. Every time I clean that theater, I get an overwhelming sense of dread. I first heard about Eldridge Manor when I moved to the small, secluded town of Eldridge. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, warning anyone who would listen to stay away from the crumbling, ancient house. It stood on a hill, its silhouette a dark and menacing presence against the gray sky, with shattered windows like hollow eyes staring out at the world. I wasn't one to believe in ghost stories, but the tales surrounding Eldridge Manor intrigued me. Built in the early 1800s by a wealthy recluse named Elias Eldridge, the mansion was once the pride of the town. Elias lived there with his wife, Arabella, and their young daughter, Isabel. The townsfolk said that tragedy struck in the winter of 1842 when a violent storm raged through the region. Isabel disappeared that night, never to be seen again, and Arabella succumbed to madness soon after. Elias, heartbroken and alone, locked himself away in the manor and was rarely seen again. They said he died of a broken heart, and since then, the manor had been abandoned, left to rot and decay. Despite the warnings and the chill that crept up my spine whenever I thought about it, I couldn't resist the urge to explore the manor. I had always been drawn to the unknown, to the mysteries that lay hidden in the shadows. One cold, foggy evening, I decided to satisfy my curiosity. I approached Eldridge Manor with a flashlight in hand, the beam cutting through the thick mist that clung to the ground like a shroud. The iron gates creaked open with a protest, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. The path leading to the front door was overgrown with weeds and brambles, and I had to push my way through the tangled foliage. As I reached the front door, I noticed it was slightly ajar, hanging crookedly on its hinges. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and decay, and the darkness seemed almost palpable, pressing in on me from all sides. I flicked on my flashlight, and the beam revealed a grand foyer, now in ruins. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, and cobwebs draped from the ceiling like ghostly veils. I moved deeper into the house, the floorboards creaking under my weight. I passed through a sitting room with decaying furniture and peeling wallpaper, and a dining room where a long table stood, covered in a thick layer of grime. Everywhere I looked, there were signs of the once opulent life that had been lived here, now reduced to ruins. I reached the grand staircase that led to the upper floors and hesitated. The stairs looked unstable, and I wasn't sure if they would hold my weight. But the urge to explore, to uncover the secrets of Eldridge Manor, was too strong to resist. I carefully placed my foot on the first step, testing it. It held. Slowly, I made my way up, the wood groaning under my feet. At the top of the stairs, I found a long hallway with several doors lining either side. I started with the first door on my left. The room inside was a bedroom, the bed covered in a dusty, moth-eaten canopy. A broken mirror hung on the wall, and the wardrobe stood open, empty save for a few tattered rags. I moved on to the next room, and the next, each one revealing more signs of decay and neglect. I was about to open the door at the end of the hall when I heard it. A faint, whispering sound, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound grew louder, more distinct, and I realized it was coming from behind the door in front of me. With trembling hands, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room inside was dark, the only light coming from my flashlight. It was a child's room with a small bed pushed against one wall and toys scattered across the floor. A doll sat in a rocking chair, its glass eyes staring blankly ahead. The whispering sound grew louder, filling the room, and I realized it was coming from the doll. I took a step closer, my flashlight trained on the doll's face. Suddenly, the rocking chair began to move, rocking back and forth on its own. The whispering grew into a low, guttural moan, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I wanted to turn and run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. Then, the doll's head turned slowly to face me, its eyes glinting in the flashlight beam. "Leave this place," a voice hissed, seeming to come from all around me. "You are not welcome here." My heart pounded in my ears as I stumbled backward, tripping over a broken toy and falling to the floor. The room seemed to close in around me, the darkness pressing down like a physical weight. I scrambled to my feet and fled, my flashlight bobbing wildly as I ran down the hall and back down the stairs. I could still hear the voice, now a chorus of whispers echoing in my mind. I burst through the front door and ran down the path, not stopping until I was back in the safety of my car. I sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, my hands shaking. I looked back at the manor, now just a dark silhouette against the night sky. The whispers had stopped, but the feeling of dread lingered. I never went back to Eldridge Manor after that night. The locals still spoke of it in hushed tones, but I had experienced enough to know that the stories were true. The manor was cursed, haunted by the spirits of the past, and whatever secrets it held, they were better left undisturbed. Even now, years later, I sometimes hear the whispers in my dreams, calling me back to Eldridge Manor. But I resist the urge, knowing that some mysteries are better left unsolved. The shadows of the past are best left to linger in the darkness, where they belong. I had always thought the stories about the old Victorian house at the end of Maple Street were just that, stories. But on that fateful night, when my parents left me alone for the weekend, I found myself caught in a nightmare I could never have imagined. It was the first time I was alone in our house. I was 16, and my parents trusted me to take care of myself while they attended a wedding out of town. I wasn't worried. I had the whole weekend planned out with video games, snacks, and late-night horror movies. Friday evening started off perfectly. I ordered pizza, played some games, and watched The Exorcist with the lights off, feeling a thrill of excitement with every jump scare. As midnight approached, I decided to head to bed. I brushed my teeth, turned off all the lights, and climbed under the covers, ready for a good night's sleep. That's when I heard the noise. It was faint at first, a soft creaking sound that seemed to be coming from somewhere deep within the house. I dismissed it as the old wood settling, or maybe a branch brushing against the window. But the noise continued, growing louder and more insistent. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the hallway just outside my bedroom. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I strained to listen, hoping to hear anything that would explain the noise away. But all I could hear was the rhythmic creak of the floorboards coming closer and closer. Gathering my courage, I slipped out of bed and tiptoed to the door. I pressed my ear against it, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but there was only silence. I let out a shaky breath and slowly opened the door. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by the moonlight streaming through the windows. I crept down the hall, my bare feet making no sound on the cold wooden floor. I checked each room, expecting to find nothing, but each shadow seemed to move. Each corner hid a lurking figure in my mind. As I reached the living room, a chill ran down my spine. The front door was wide open. I knew I had locked it before going to bed. I stepped outside, peering into the darkness, but there was no one there. I quickly shut the door and locked it again, double-checking this time. Just as I turned to head back to my room, the lights went out. The house was plunged into darkness, and I stood there, paralyzed by fear. My mind raced, trying to remember where I had left the flashlight. I fumbled my way to the kitchen, bumping into furniture and stubbing my toe against the coffee table. I finally found the flashlight and turned it on, the weak beam cutting through the darkness. I felt a little better with the light in my hand and decided to check the circuit breaker in the basement. I hated the basement. It was cold and damp, and the air always felt heavy with a musty smell that clung to my clothes. I opened the door to the basement and shone the flashlight down the stairs. The beam barely reached the bottom, casting long, sinister shadows on the walls. I took a deep breath and descended the steps, each creak of the old wood echoing in the confined space. As I reached the bottom, I heard it again. Footsteps, but this time they were above me. I looked up, the beam of the flashlight following my gaze, but there was nothing there. I found the circuit breaker and flipped the switches, hoping to restore the power, but nothing happened. Suddenly, the footsteps grew louder, faster, and more erratic, as if someone was running through the house. Panic surged through me, and I raced back up the stairs. When I reached the top, the footsteps stopped, and an eerie silence filled the air. I stood there, flashlight trembling in my hand, trying to steady my breathing. I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel a presence, something watching me, lurking in the shadows. I moved slowly, cautiously, back towards my room, every instinct telling me to get out of the house, but I was too terrified to leave. As I reached my bedroom, I saw it, a dark figure standing at the end of the hall. It was tall, its features obscured by the darkness, but I could feel its eyes on me, boring into my soul. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt like lead. The figure took a step forward, and I stumbled back into my room, slamming the door shut. I locked it and pressed my back against it, the flashlight beam shaking as I pointed it towards the door. The handle rattled, and the door shook as if someone, or something, was trying to get in. I backed away, my heart in my throat, and climbed onto my bed, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. The door continued to rattle, the sound growing more and more violent. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. I waited, not daring to move or make a sound. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Finally, I gathered the courage to approach the door. I pressed my ear against it, listening for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Slowly, I unlocked the door and opened it a crack. The hallway was empty. I stepped out, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and made my way to the living room. The front door was open again, swaying gently in the breeze. I didn't hesitate this time. I grabbed my phone, my keys, and ran out of the house. I didn't stop until I was at my neighbor's doorstep, pounding on the door, desperate for someone to let me in. They took me in, listened to my frantic explanation, and called the police. When the officers arrived, they searched the house but found no signs of an intruder. They chalked it up to my imagination, fueled by too many horror movies and the stress of being alone for the first time. But I knew what I had experienced was real. The footsteps, the open door, the dark figure. It wasn't just in my mind. The house at the end of Maple Street held secrets, dark and terrible, and I had come face to face with one of them. I never stayed alone in that house again. The memories of that night haunted me, a constant reminder of the shadows that lurk just beyond the edge of our understanding. Even now, years later, I can't walk down Maple Street without feeling a chill run down my spine. Some stories are more than just stories. Some nightmares are real. And sometimes, the darkness is not as empty as it seems.